Yeah. I went to so much. So downtown. So that was. I'm like, I'm still. I'm not gonna buy that. Oh, okay.
All right, everybody, we're gonna get started. So I'm gonna ask Stevie to stop talking.
So sorry.
Turn to her seats. Julia is gonna introduce Peter. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Hi, so thank you all for coming, and we are joined by the lovely Peter Markus. So Peter Markus is the author of a novel, Bob or Man on Boat, as well as 5 other books. Fiction, the most recent fiction is When Our Fathers Return to Us as Birds. But collection poetry, I apologize, I'm so sorry. His fiction has appeared widely in anthologies and journals, including the Chicago Review, Iowa Review, Alaska Quarterly Review, Black Warrior Review, Quarterly West, Massachusetts Review, Northwest Review, amongst many others. He was awarded a Kearsarge Arts in Detroit Fellowship in 2012 and has taught for over 20 years as a writer in residence with the Inside Out Literary Arts Project.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks for everyone who is here, some old friends. That's really delightful to see Josh Dorman, Pam Ryder, Josh Kornreich, Steve Silver, who I've never met before, but we're pals, Pete Gallup, Robert's students that I got a chance to hear workshopping fiction today. It was really delightful to be here. And it's cool just to be back in New York. I haven't been in the city, I think, since 2008, when this book came out, and I did a reading at McNally Jackson for that book. And I haven't really been writing much fiction at all of late, which is okay because I'm writing poems, which I feel really good about. And that's really what I've been reading from. But because I visited the fiction class here, I think I'm going to go back in time to when I was writing fiction that felt like, okay, this is, there's something here, there in these stories. And I spent about 10 years writing stories about these 2 boys who happen to be brothers. You don't really need to know too much about these 2 boys other than they're brothers, I guess. In Robert's class today, we looked at they talked about Jesus's Son by Dennis Johnson, which is definitely Johnson's best book, and everybody seemed to had read that book, and maybe some of his other work seemed to be of the same opinion about that book that sort of has a kind of magic. And the stories that I'm going to read from my first book, Good Brother, for me, I haven't been able to write fiction that has that same kind of energy or spark to it. And I wrote these stories in the late 90s. The book came out in 2001. So I have this great nostalgia for these brothers. It's sort of like how a band when they put out their first couple records and they're amazing, and then they get old or something, or they start to think about how can I become more famous? And then they just start writing and making not such good music. Not that I ever considered like, how could I become a more famous writer? Because that's not the kind of writing, as you'll see, that I write. But the other books that I've written just don't have that same kind of vitality to them. And maybe other artists sort of experience that as well. So I'm going to read at least a couple stories from this book, and then we'll do like an interview with Julia. My friends Iki and Chris Moore are now walking in. This is really great to see so many friendly, familiar faces. Chris, you're just right on time. Please take a seat, get comfortable. I'm about to read Good Brother. And Chris is one of my brothers. Josh is a brother. Pete Gallup's a brother. Robert Lopez is a brother. Josh Dorman, did I say you're a brother? Pam Ryder is a sister. Good brother. We used to take the fish we'd catch out of this dirty river that runs through this dirty river town, and we used to cut off those still glistening with silver scaled heads, and we used to nail them, those heads, into the backyard telephone pole out back behind our yard. We'd hammer nails into those fishes' cold water-eyed heads and make for ourselves what my brother and me used to call our backyard fishing pole. We did not stop fishing for and catching and nailing those fishes' heads into wood until the day our father came home from work and told us we were leaving. When our father told us we were leaving, he meant it. We were leaving for good, this dirty river, this dirty town. We did not want to leave, my brother and me. We did not want to leave behind the town or the river or the fish-headed telephone pole that the two of us brothers turned into a back-of-the-yard fishing pole out back behind the backyard shed where our father kept his hammers and his saws and his cigar boxes full of rusty bent-back nails and his nuts and bolts and screws and those bottles of his half filled up with whiskey. At night, from our bedroom's window, my brother and me could look outside and see those fishes' marbly looking eyes looking back all wall-eyed out from the sides of their chopped off heads. The biggest of the big-lipped fish looked like they might leap out and bite the hand left dangling over the side of a boat. Each of the fish heads, us brothers, we gave each one a name. In the end, there were exactly 150 fish heads named, each with its own name. Not one was called Jimmy or John. Jimmy and John were my brothers and my real names, but we called each other brother. Our father called us brothers son. When our father hollered out, son, the both of us brothers would turn back our boy heads. We both knew we were crossing this river together. Our mother called us brothers her dirty little boys. Us brothers were made, our mother liked to say, in the muddy image of our father. We did not like it much when our mother made us wash the mud from off the bottoms of our muddy boots. We liked mud and those dirty river smells that smelled of fishing and worms. We did not like it when our mother made us wash our hands to rid ourselves of those fishy river smells. We liked the way the fish's silver fish scales stuck to and glittered sparkly in our hands. At night, we liked to hold our hands up to the moonlight shining into our bedroom window. It looked like our hands had been dipped in stars. But our mother and our father both were sick and tired of living in a town with a dirty river running through it and with river winds that always smelled of fish. Our mother said she wanted to go somewhere. Anywhere is the word she used, so long as anywhere was west of here. West where was what our father wanted to know. And what our mother said to this was, west of all this muddy water, somewhere, our mother said, where there's not so much mud and rusted steel. There's a bigger sky, our mother wanted us brothers to know. There's a sky, our mother told us. There's a sky not stunted by smokestacks and smoke. Us brothers couldn't picture a sky bigger than the sky outside our backyard. We didn't want to imagine a town without a dirty river running through it where we could run down to it to fish. We did not want to run or be moved away from all this smoke and water and mud. We didn't know what we were going to do or how we were going to stay until we looked outside and saw our fish. The fish heads were looking back at us, open-eyed, open-mouthed, and it was like they were singing to us brothers. That night, us brothers, we climbed outside through our bedroom's window. Only the moon and stars were watching us as we walked out back to our father's tool shed and dug out his hammers in a box full of rusty, bent back nails. We each of us brothers grabbed a handful of nails and a hammer into each of our hands and walked over to our fish-headed telephone pole. Brother, I said to brother, you can go first. Give me your hand, I told him. Hold your hand up against this wood. Brother did like I told. We were brothers. We were each other's voice inside our own heads. This might sting, I warned. And then I raised back that hammer. I drove that rusty nail right through brother's hand. Brother didn't even wince or flinch with his body or make with his boy mouth the sound of a brother crying out. Good, brother, I said. I was hammering in another nail into brother's other hand when our father stepped out into the yard. Son, our father called out. Us, our father's sons, we turned back our heads toward the sound of our father. We waited to hear what it was that our father was going to say to us brothers next. It was a long few seconds. The sky above the river where the steel mill stood like some sort of a shipwreck. It was dark and quiet. Somewhere, I was sure, the sun was shining. You boys remember to clean up before you come back in, our father said. Our father turned back his back. Us brothers turned back to face back each other. I raised back the hammer. I lined up that rusted nail. Well, that's the first story that I wrote about these boys who happen to be brothers and are very devoted to where they're from. And they sort of, over the course of about 10 or 12 years, I couldn't stop writing about these two boys who happen to be brothers. So I wrote this book, Good Brother, published by Calamari Press. This book, The Singing Fish, published by Calamari Press. And then this book called We Make Mud by Dzanc Books. In between some of those books, I wrote a book called Bobber Man on Boat to see if I could write a book that didn't have these brothers in it. And I failed because the main character in that book is a guy named Bob who lives on a boat and is sort of fishing obsessively for this one singular fish. And at some point I was doing real well, but then this guy falls off a boat and then he drowns, and then his boat washes up onto this dirty river shore, and these two boys happen to find it. So they were like, you can't turn us off that way. So then I wrote a book called The Fish and the Not Fish. You're maybe sort of cluing in on some words that I love, words that are part of my lexicon. And this book I wrote, and it's a book that's told entirely in monosyllabic words. So words like brother, I couldn't use, or words like river. They didn't make an appearance in that book. So I'm going to read another one where a second boy, or a third boy, I guess, comes into play in this fiction. I was hoping one of my former students was going to be here, Michael R. Jackson, who's a playwright. Some of you might know his play. What's the name of this play? A Strange Loop. Because I think of this story all the time. I was teaching at a young writers conference up in northern Michigan, and I wish he was here because I would call him out on something he said about this story. And I'll tell you after I read the story. But this is a story called Boy. We knew this other boy in town who was brother to nobody, an only child with only a mother and a father and no brother to call his own. So we took him in as brother. We did not call him brother, though. We called him Boy. Boy was littler than us brothers. Boy was born years, no, centuries after we were born. We were down by the river with our fishing man father the day that this boy was born into this world. This boy, this brother, we were told, was born with teeth and a full head of hair. What he was not born with, we discovered, was a tongue. This boy's mouth was a hole in his face he fed food into. Once in a while, we might hear some mouthy sounds come grunting out, but for the most part, Boy was silent. Some of the time, we did not even know he was nearby us brothers, standing close by, his feet flopping inside his father's boots, buried knee-deep in the river's mud. At times, Boy was more dog than he was a boy. Boy was a dog who always came whenever we called, to do whatever we told. Us brothers taught Boy more than a few tricks. We taught Boy how to walk on water. It's true that Boy drowned the first time he walked out. Boy floated face down the river, but then he walked upriver back to us brothers. Good dog, we told Boy. We scratched Boy's back. We pulled a bone out from Boy's hand and tossed it to the river. Boy, we told Boy, go fish. Boy took to that muddy river water like he was part dog, part fish. Then Boy swam back to the river's muddy bank and flopped down on the shore. Yes, just like a fish. This boy here is a keeper, brother said. If you say so, I said to brother, and then we chopped off this boy's head. So is this funny, isn't it? Yeah. When I read this in a bar in Brooklyn in 2001 with Sam Lipsyte, people think it's really funny.
Yeah.
And it is.
Just a couple of us are joking.
But when Michael R. Jackson was at this young writers conference and he was sitting next to this other young writer, and she kind of gasped at that, like, we chopped off Boy's head. And Michael said to her, don't worry, it's a metaphor. And I said, I said, hold on a second. What do you mean it's a metaphor? If I say that they chopped off Boy's head, they chopped off Boy's head. Doesn't matter if, the next day he grew a new head back. One more, and then we'll do a little interview, and then we'll sort of open this up to a conversation. Usually I like to read for like an hour and like sort of lock the door. But these days, like with attention spans and all that, it's like get them in, get them out. Yeah, I don't know. No one wants to see a grown man cry. You guys want to see a grown man cry? Yeah. All right, I'll read a poem. So this is the third story I'll read, and then maybe I'll read a poem from my book, When Our Fathers Returned to Us as Birds. What the river told us to do. We watched our father hammer and pound into our front yard's ground, a handmade sign that said, in letters big enough for us brothers to read what it said, all the way down from where we were watching, down by the muddy river's muddy shore, house for sale. We'd seen signs like this sign before, sticking up from the front yards of other people's houses, but never in the front of ours. We knew what happened to those people who hammered those signs down into the ground in the fronts of their houses' front yards. After a while, those people with signs out in the fronts of their houses left away from our town and were soon replaced by new people who came to live on the insides of these kinds of houses. Us brothers, we did not want to be one of those people. We didn't want our house to be that kind of a house. Our house, we did not want it to be a house with anybody but us living inside it. But us brothers, we both knew that this, us living in some other house, in some other town, a town without a dirty river running through it, a town without so much mud and smoke and rust. This was what our mother said she wanted for the both of us. We'd heard her say to our father that it was either this house in this dirty river town, or it was her that was leaving. Us, our mother's dirty boys, we listened up close. We hoped we might one night hear the sound of footsteps leaving, a door opening, then closing shut. Later on that day, when us brothers saw our father working on the making and the painting and the nailing together of that sign that said on it, house for sale, we asked our father, what was he doing? Then what was it the sign for? We stood by and watched our father's mouth move around to make such sounds as mother and river and town. We watched our father raise up his hand and point with his first finger to where the mill was sitting dark and quiet on the river's muddy shore. But us brothers, we didn't want our ears to hear what it was that our father was wanting us to hear. And our eyes, when we looked upriver at the mill, it's sitting silent and still. What we saw was the moon rising up, big and white and glowing, the mill's rusted smokestacks holding it up. Us brothers said some words back to our father, words such as moon and mud and river and fish. But even these words that were the world to us brothers, these were sounds that our father did not hear. We watched our father drop his head back down so that he could see his right hand holding his hammer. In his other hand, he held a handful of bent back nails. When our father did this with his hands, us brothers did this with ours. We each of us took the other one of us by the hand, and we went with each other down to the river to ask the river, what should we, us brothers, do? When the river told us what to do, we both of us knew it was the only thing we could do. So that night, while our mother and our father were both of them in their room with the lights in their room turned off for sleeping, what we did was we climbed out through our bedroom's window. Only the moon and the stars were watching us that night as we walked out to our father's tool shed and got out his hammers and a box full of his rusty bent back nails. We each of us brothers took up a fistful of nails and a hammer into each one of our hands, and we walked out back to the back of our backyard, back to where there was a telephone pole back there, studded with the chopped off heads of fish. Brother, I said to brother, you can go first. Brother, I told him, give me your hand. Hold your hand up against this pole. Brother did just what I told. We were brothers. We were each other's voice inside our own heads. This might sting, I warned, and then I raised back that hammer. I drove that rusty nail right through brother's hand. Brother didn't even wince or flinch with his body or make with his boy mouth the sound of a brother crying out. Good, brother, I said. I was hammering a second nail into brother's other hand when our father stepped out into the yard. Us, our father's sons, we turned back with our heads toward the sound of our father. We stood like this, waiting to hear what it was that our father was going to say to us brothers next. It was a long few seconds. The sky above the river where the steel mill stood shipwrecked in the mud, it was dark and silent. Somewhere, I was sure, the sun was shining. You boys remember to clean up before you come back in, our father said to us then. Our father turned back his back. Us brothers turned back to face back each other. I raised back the hammer. I lined up that rusted nail. Should I read a poem? I'll try not to cry. It's so funny, like, I don't see myself as a poet, yet I wrote a book of poems. So I'm not sure if that makes me a poet or not. Sometimes my students will ask me, like, well, what makes a poet a poet? What makes a writer? And I just say, well, if you write poems, I guess you're a poet. If you write fiction, you're a fiction writer. If you just write, you're a writer. But I struggled a little bit just because, like, when I was in grad school, the fiction writers made fun of the poets, right? Because they were soft and they would give readings and they would cry. And now, all these years later, I see myself as a poet who, I guess, is not afraid sometimes to cry in public. But I probably won't. It's usually a kind of, if I read more than one poem. But this is a book about when my father got pretty sick, lost all of his abilities to walk and take care of himself. And my mother was 98% of the time doing everything by herself. And occasionally I would be there for 2% of the time. And, you know, the inclination when somebody gets really sick is, you know, or when death sort of enters into your house, it's like, you know, you want to run. And I knew that that wasn't the proper or the dutiful response. So I decided to look closer to that thing itself. And then once I did, these poems started to visit me and to inhabit me, and I couldn't stop writing poems for the first time in my life. And then I'm still writing poems. It makes me think of something that Robert Lopez said about someone warned him, once you write a book of nonfiction, you're never going to be able to write fiction again. And I feel that maybe is something that's happening with me with poems, because now my next book that I'm currently sort of assembling is a book of poems. So maybe I'm a poet. What my father did not have to say. In his final days, my father did not speak because he could not speak. He did not ask how the car was running or about the kids or his granddog. He did not ask about work. He did not look out at the boats on the river to say, there goes a 32-footer, or the lines on that boat are really fine. He did not say the water was at its highest in 25 years. If his thin lips moved at all, it was only when I wiped them with a wet washcloth or put yogurt on a spoon up to them, hoping he would eat. He did not eat and he did not speak, and soon his breathing slowed until there was nothing. He'd been slowly dying and now he was dead. I did not know what to say, and so I said little out loud. I walked down to the river where I thought maybe I would find something there to tell me what I was supposed to do now. The loons sat on the water and dove under when a boat motored close by. They did not sing, not right then at least. Only later at night did they call out to each other, their voices crisscrossing the river in the April dark. All right, thank you guys for being here. Michael Jackson just walked in. I was just anecdotally talking about the first time I think I even read a story called Boy, where it ends, Michael, where the brothers chop off Boy's head. And there was a young writer sitting next to you up in Houghton Lake, Michigan. And she sort of, and you said, oh, don't worry, it's just a metaphor, right? And I was like, no, it's not a metaphor, it's a real thing. So nice to see you. Michael Jackson, a former student of mine, Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. Very proud of him.
All right, so what we're gonna do is, you sit down next to Julia.
Okay.
Elaine will be coming through to readjust the camera, and I will show that afterwards.
That's Josh Bornwright, who's also one of my former students. I'm proud of you, Josh.
Oh, my, sorry. You turn them on, they get off red and then the green and then the other thing.
We're on.
Ooh, I think so.
All right.
Alrighty. Well, thanks for reading like that poem, especially is one of my favorites. I know the subject of which was losing your father, but it reminded me of losing my grandmother to dementia, and how like there's so much in absence that you should fill the space. So, you know, what your father didn't do, like, you know, took so much space in what, you know, seemed like a void at first.
Yeah, that word "not" is such a powerful word. You know, the things that he did not say, did not do, was unable to, those sort of basic tasks. But it's a really powerful word. I actually teach a workshop where I just sort of focus on feeding students lines that, you know, words like never, not, can't, because oftentimes we're asked to write about like, what do you remember? What do you want? What do you know? And I think sometimes that sort of, I don't know, I see a lot of students freeze up when they're asked to think about and to even write about what they know or what they remember. So it's sort of a way to tricking them into sort of liberating some new material that might be, I don't remember this, I don't know this, but I do know or remember something else. And then that becomes the thing that they're writing about. So it's sort of a way to almost disable or disarm them. And I use, you know, the things that I teach my students, I sometimes listen to my own advice, which is sometimes good.
I think that's like super interesting. I think that gets students maybe into a more reflective mindset. You have to like think back of like what not. The instinct is to kind of stay in the moment. Speaking of getting reflective, I wanted to ask what kind of got you first into writing? I think as humans, we're all kind of storytellers, whether it's telling your friend what happened on the train or something like that. But, you know, what turns like that natural human instinct to communicate into something that you put to paper? So kind of how that developed.
Yeah, I mean, I ask that question to my students all the time, like, why do you write? Like, what is that impulse to say something or to create or tell a story? I'm a terrible storyteller. I think even as a story writer, I don't know how to tell a story. I know how to sort of manipulate sentences into what might pass off as a story or as a work of fiction, but I'm not naturally inclined orally to sort of captivate an audience. I like sentences, I like words, but so that's sort of on some level when I was older led me to the page. You fail at being a musician and you say, well, what next? My arm was unable to throw a baseball 95 miles an hour. I gave up that ambition. I had a teacher in third grade Mrs. Fortner, who, I wrote a poem about a cloud and she put it up on the wall and said, good job. Maybe that was why I sort of committed my life to sometimes making things up. My mother was a great storyteller to me and told me stories about the moon and the stars. She believed me when I had an imaginary friend and played games with me and Jerry. What led me to these stories about these two brothers when my wife was pregnant with our son Solomon, and we have a daughter who I was like, how do I divide my love between this little beautiful creature and this one that's right now still in womb, and the word brother became a word that I used in a way that I never had because I don't have brothers except for Chris Moore and Josh Dorman and Robert Lopez, but they came to me later on. I grew up brotherless. So maybe sometimes we write stories to, for those things that we don't have, naturally. I don't know. But eventually I just sort of like started to take myself seriously, which I think is maybe the most important thing for any young writer to do, is to sort of believe and invest in myself. And I was a terrible writer, and maybe I still am, but I was a terrible writer when I was in undergrad. When I was in an MFA program, I was a terrible writer. There's one thing I could offer students at this level is to tell you, don't worry too much about the stories that you guys are workshopping, because if you're lucky, nobody's ever going to see them except for your cohorts. Because I think the stuff that you write when you're just sort of figuring things out, if you're lucky, it might be the thing that you find. You're all looking for that something. Jack Gilbert has a poem called Finding Something that I teach constantly. He begins by talking about the moon as horses tempered in the dark, or some sort of strange metaphor that poets love to sometimes lean on. But then 6 lines in it, he says, Michiko is dying in the house behind me. And that's the poem. That's the something, But I don't think you find that something until you sort of luck into it. Or in the case of my father, he got sick, and like that became something that I couldn't stop thinking about and paying attention to. So all of those things are maybe what brought me to the page and maybe keeps me there even now, when the world is often saying, why bother? Stop, And then I have a few friends who say, don't listen to that. What do you mean?
Yeah, no, I think it's super interesting that we all come into writing from different ways and kind of end up, here talking to each other, discussing stories. My own journey began when I stole my brother's older books. He should have hid them better. That's his fault. So just interesting how, you said you don't regard yourself as a storyteller, but that's really interesting to kind of.
I don't know how to tell a story. I don't know what plot means. A character, is a word to me, whether it's brother or Bob. I don't think beyond, like, that's how those characters live. I'll often ask students, well, what do you know about that character? Like, you should know everything that I could spontaneously ask you. Like, what's their favorite breakfast food? What kind of cigarettes do they smoke? And they'll come up with an answer: Marlboro Red, pancakes and bacon. If someone were to ask me that, I'd say that's the most ridiculous question you've ever asked me in your life. Right? Bob doesn't eat breakfast, right? The brothers, they eat river, they eat mud, like, they're not real. What were we talking about?
It devolved into something more interesting.
Yeah. But, you mentioned your brother and not hiding books. My sister was a reader, turned me on early on to, like Elie Wiesel's Night when I was too young to read a book like that.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, I was talking to her about like how I blame her for me becoming a writer, because when I was a teenager, she was reading Stephen King's The Shining. And at 3 a.m, she started like screaming bloody murder. And I woke up, my mom and dad woke up and run into her room like, what's going on? We thought like someone had broken in and were, taking an axe to her or something. And, she had this book on her lap and she was just literally freaking out about something that she read in this book. And I was like, damn, a book? Like a book can like do that? That's powerful. Emily Dickinson talks about a poem taking your head off. Kafka and this axe that chops open the frozen sea within us. And then there was Stephen King, who this book inhabited my sister in a way that she almost was acting possessed. I was like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, like that's a super interesting like way to look at it, of like how that can just like fascinate you, like the power of that. When reading, especially the book of poems, it seemed very, there's atmospheric, and also a bit like therapy to me. And I was just kind of wondering, with your process, at least as it is now, like, would you say that writing for you is cathartic, or is it, how would you describe like, writing, what it does to you right now?
I mentioned, when my dad got sick and the impulse was, turn away. And then I said, no, that's not the right way to do it. Let's get in the weeds with it and let's do what we can. As a son, I felt like I owed him that in the very least. And that really, by going in closer to, something that was very heavy and hard to emotionally sort of grapple with, it prepared me for when he did die, and it had been a long journey. When he did finally sort of turn away from the river and sort of say, I've had enough. And, basically in 3 days, he sort of, you stop eating, like your body just sort of shuts down. And, for my mom, who was there, 24/7, she was like, oh, it happened so quick. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, you've been like keeping him alive. And it was by writing about it and sort of like I was processing death before he was dead. So that when he did die, I was like, okay, there's certain things that I can do. So I walked down to the river, got a glass of water and anointed his body with the river, I shaved my father. Like I did the things that are just like that was the therapy, but the poems sort of made me able to sort of care for him all the way through to the end. So, but the writing just sort of like centered me. It made me appreciate things that I hadn't really appreciated, like being able to walk and talk. So yeah, if you want to call that therapy, I'm all for it. I just sort of maybe just call it making sense of, the world that we're given, and then making something that you can then give to other people. The one thing that I'm proud of with this book of poems that I've never felt proud about my fiction is that the poems seem to be useful to other people. I'll give a reading and someone will like come up to me afterwards or through Zoom or whatever, and they'll be like, Peter. And here I'm thinking of this one specific woman who lives in Windsor, Ontario. And I was doing a Zoom reading and she had read the book. She goes, Peter, I read every word in your book. She was very deliberate about what she was saying. And I just want to let you know, and this is through Zoom, this is like post-pandemic sort of stuff. We're all in our own boxes. She leans into the screen and I'm sort of thinking, well, this could go one of many ways. Like, I read every word in your book and I just want to let you know you're a bullshitter. You don't know anything about death, right? Like, it wasn't whatever I was like, hope that's not what she says. But she goes, I just want to let you know that every word that you wrote about your father was true for me in my experience with when my mother got sick and died. And then thank you. Like, that was like cool. I've had other people who've experienced other types of losses and deaths and grief say things like that. Whereas with the fiction, it's like, writers like Robert Lopez would reach out to me through the internet and say, I read a story by you, man. That was cool. Like, who are you? And I would read one of his fictions and say, who are you? And we became friends and brothers and things like that. But I don't know that the fiction was useful other than as a writer, So, but as like the poems seem to be useful to other people who might not be writers, who are just humans. And that makes, that means a lot to me.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. I don't consider myself a poet either, and very much identify with that fiction title. But for me, those poems like really did a lot for me. I enjoyed the fiction pieces. I liked like the repetition and the language and kind of the defamiliarization and just kind of the work being done there. But like what really stuck with me was kind of the poems, how we were, the setting was similar. There was like the loons and kind of that Midwestern ethereal feel. But it resonated with me, grew up in the desert and like thinking about a different person, but it still really resonated.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, everything that I write happens or revolves around this river, the mud, the steel mill that no longer makes steel, brothers, fathers, sons, just that sort of family unit. Those are just my things, what I call luminous things when I teach. And you just, as a writer, I think you just are in search of those things. When you find them, there's usually once you start putting those words into some sort of motion through the power of a sentence, then you might have a story by my definition. Something might happen out of those words, all of which are nouns, of course.
Speaking of like story generation, in one of your past interviews, I think it was like the Fiction Writer's Review or something, you mentioned that you wrote a sentence that you liked and you liked the words in it, and then more sentences were like born to that initial one, and that kind of was how something was started. Is that usually how stories are like born to you, or is it just okay?
Yeah, usually it's a sentence and then everything there is sort of unpacked from that. With the poems, it was a sentence or some iteration of it where I was waking up at 5 a.m, just which is something my father did his whole life, whether or not he had to work or not. 5 a.m. he woke up. I used to say, what are you doing waking up when you can sleep in? But he was waking up just because that was his ritual. It was his time to himself before the day began. And now that resonates with me. But I would wake up and in my head was a sentence like, my father is dying in the house across the river, or across the river in a house, my father is dying, or any way that you might reshape that sentence. I couldn't get away from it. The same way I couldn't get away from those brothers, and that's a good problem if you're a writer. That's how books get written. And it's like how Dennis Johnson writes Jesus's Son. Those stories had to be written, right? That's why that book, because I'm pointing at this guy whose name I forget, but he's read that book 6 times, and it's a part of you. Carry that book inside of you. Same thing, the dude over there who's friends with Troy Weaver, like you read that book 6 times, and I asked you, why haven't you read any of his other books 6 times? Because that's the book, So tonight you guys got a treat because I read you from that one book. That's my book. All the other books are just like playthings, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with playing around, because sometimes out of play comes some really serious stuff. Like I've got friends or readers who, have said, no, man, your stories are like important. They're saying that really moved me. Okay, if you say so. But I know when the poems move somebody because they're more direct, they're more honest, they're more real. You guys know I'm just making shit up. Robert and I, we did an interview somewhere years ago where the title of it was, we're just making this shit up, right? That's all we're doing when you're writing fiction. I think when you're writing a poem, you're not making this up. You're just making sense of what's here right in front of you.
Yeah, and I was sort of wondering, going back to fiction, you stayed with the subject of like the brothers for about 12 years?
Yeah.
What spurred you to kind of realize that you just couldn't write about them anymore? Did they just stop visiting you one
It wasn't that
day, or
I was afraid that I couldn't stop. So that's why I wrote the book Bob. That's why I wrote the book The Fish and the Not Fish. The brothers were still there, like still saying, there's more to us. I mean, I would love now to revisit them and go back and like continue with them, though I don't know that I could. I think I killed them through these other books. So maybe they're just dead and I need to resurrect them. And I would love to do that because I can't write a sentence these days that looks like fiction if I tried to do it. And I have tried, and it doesn't have anything to it. It doesn't have that something. It just not connected to it. And then these poems keep coming. There are new poems. My dad's still dead. And I'm still shaped by his absence, but like the world still exists. And I like to take walks with my dog along the river and the marsh and write about it.
Yeah, and I was wondering, so
Let's
oh,
ask
sorry.
anybody has a question.
I give really long answers sometimes. Who has got a question? Thanks, Julia. Those were all beautiful responses.
Yeah.
I have a question about your-
Yeah.
when you were reading, like, first or second,
Yeah, I think that's what they call it. Yeah. Sometimes.
but my experience of it is very, like, there's just one perspective, right? There's not a lot of information between the two brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're talking about the boy, that there's a second boy coming in. So
Yeah.
I thought about, oh, is there you ever thought about if there are any sort of rumor that exists with one person?
I've had people ask me something similar to that, or even my publisher, Derek White, who's not here, sort of wrote something that suggested that maybe there's not actually two there. In my brain, there's brothers plural, and that one of them seems to be doing more of the acting and maybe the telling as well. Are they twins? Are they conjoined twins? I mean, maybe. But again, it's like there's brother and brother, and that's sort of how the plural there is us brothers. And then there's the third boy, who I did say the second boy. So maybe, you always got to trust your typos. Or the things that you just say and don't realize what you're actually saying. Yeah.
There's all those brothers, there's just undertow of violence, pressure that goes throughout it, typically ends in this culmination of brutality. Is that something that would work for consciously, or do you just trust that works with that?
Yeah, that just happened, because it was there right in the opening paragraph. There's this pole covered with all these heads, right? It's a permanent fixture of their beautiful world that is almost totemic to them. And so there's a moment in that story that's really autobiographical. And it's something to the effect of, we didn't know what we were going to do or how we were going to stay until we looked outside and saw our fish. Because I was like, well, what am I going to do with this story? Like I said, I'm not good at plot. I'm not good at figuring out what should happen in a story. So I was stuck in that first story, Good Brother, figuring out how to let this fiction play itself out. And then there was that sentence. And then I went back to the beginning and saw that poll, and I was like, that's what they have to do. The hammer is in the first paragraph, the rusty bent back nails, the tool shed, the telephone pole with all the fish heads on it. There's only one thing that they could do, right? Whether or not that's an act of violence, or is it taking one for the team? I did a visit. I visited a school in Kansas City, Missouri once, who had a high school that had read one of those books, either Good Brother or The Singing Fish. And that's how one of a little 15-year-old, first they said, oh, you're the guy who writes about mud and fish, which is kind of a cool way to be known, I think. I think every writer needs to be able to be pointed at and say, oh, you're the guy who writes about, this. And then one of the other kids said something when we were talking about the story. Someone said something, and then he said, no, man, they're just the brother takes it. He takes it for the team, right? So almost like an act of sacrifice, which we talked about today in Robert's class, and we were reading Jesus' Son. And, it's just like it's like, this is it's inevitable. Like, I think every ending of a story should be the inevitable thing that has to happen. But most writers are just making it up. Anyone else? Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for being here to you.
So I'm wondering, one of the things that really stands out and it's really cool in your writing is the repetition in the words that you are obsessed with or whatever. Do you ever start off with more of those words and cut back, or feel like there's not enough and throw them in, or how's your process with that?
The words just always are there, you find those certain words, but even a word like back, how many times did that, back of the backyard or whatever. I mean, that's all intentional, just for the purpose of rhythm, Matt Bell, who's an interesting writer, wrote an essay about my work that was published in the Collagist, I think is how you pronounce it. And he actually counted how many times, or did a word search or whatever in my book, We Make Mud, and how many times the word brother appears on how many pages. The book itself is maybe 150 pages. I think that word is on maybe 148 of them. He did the same for mud. He did the same for river. So all those are just sort of, again, like they're not just words, they're the world itself. So it just makes sense that those words appear in most sentences, you know. It's a very limited vocabulary or lexicon. And I think that works for me. I try to get my students to sort of try that as an approach, but most of them don't trust it. And then they just go on to writing the stuff that they like to write about. So, you know, it works for me, but maybe doesn't work for most people. But I love those words. And so like the other theory there is if you love those words a lot, then maybe every story you write is a love story. So, which I view my stories and my poems too, to be love poems or love stories, because I love the language. Not all words, but those particular words, you know, I fell in love with them the way you fall in love with anything or anyone. We might have time for one more, I don't know.
Well, that's a really good note to end on.
Or we could just end there.
So why don't we end, and we thank Peter for this.
It's always good to end on love, right? Yeah. Good call, Robert.
Thanks, everybody. The raid starts.
Hold it.
Yeah. Reading your book fiction, you mean, we have to feel like an active writer. Reading your book fiction, I like I like to be able to put together kind of. Right.